fellow Toastmasters and guests. The technical presentation tonight is a historical event. 200 years ago, if you lived in the tropics, you'd never been cool. If you lived in a temperate climate, you were only cool in the wintertime. If you want to preserve food, you had your choices: salting, spicing, pickling, drying, or smoking. The butcher slaughtered meat just for his daily trade. Fresh fruits and vegetables were only available in the local markets. Storing and shipping fresh farm produce was not practical. Milk was only good for a day or two. Ale and beer brewing requires cool temperatures, so it was only done during the cold climates, cold months. One man changed all this. His name was Frederick Tudor, and he lived in Boston. He changed the world and became very wealthy. In New England, ice was an expensive luxury product, available only to the wealthy. Ice houses were fairly common on the large estates. They would cut the ice from their ponds in the wintertime and put it in an ice house. An ice house was an extremely well-insulated building that kept winter ice through most of the summer. The walls are very thick and filled with insulation. Tudor began the ice trade in 1806. He began to export ice on a commercial basis. His plan was to export ice as a luxury good to the wealthy residents in the West Indies in the southern states. He hoped they would relish his product during their sweltering summers. He started by investing in a ship to transport ice, which he bought to local farmers near Boston. The first shipment took place when Tudor transported a cargo of ice from Boston to the Caribbean island of Martinique. Not very successful, very hampered. There's no place to store the ice when they got there. The customers weren't used to it, and if they bought it, they had to use it immediately. Most of the stocks melted. He continued on. By 1810, he started to make a small profit. 1815, he borrowed some money, and he built an ice house in Havana, Cuba. It was a double-walled structure, 25 feet square on its outside dimensions, 19 feet square on the inside. Held 150 tons of ice. If you do the arithmetic, his wall thickness was 3 feet. Some kind of insulation. A year later, he was shipping more and more ice to Cuba. It became a very efficient trade. He expanded, opened up new markets, went to the 3 southern cities: Savannah, Georgia, Charleston, South Carolina, and New Orleans, Louisiana. Business improved. He spent the next few months experimenting with various kinds of insulation. Ice was packed aboard ship with wood shavings, sawdust, or rice chaff on the outside. The blocks are fitted together very closely like masonry inside. He constructed ice houses throughout the tropics and created a demand there for cold refreshments. By 1825, he's doing very well with his ice sales. His problem became stock and a shortage of ice. One of his suppliers, named Nathaniel Wyatt, harnessed a horse to a metal blade to cut the ice. This ice plow was a huge improvement. He tripled ice production in the next several years. In 1833, he went into partnership with another Boston merchant named Samuel Austin to ship ice to India.
Oh boy.
16,000 miles,
Jeez.
4-month trip.
Jeez.
First shipment was in May of 1833. He had the brig Tuscany. It sailed with a hold of 180 tons of ice cut the previous winter. 4 months later,
Sounds a puddle.
He arrived in India in September. People initially thought it was a joke. He was shipping it, but he still had 100 tons. Less than half had melted. Over the next 20 years, Calcutta was his most lucrative market. He made over $200,000 in ice sales just in Calcutta. They built ice houses for storage in India, in Calcutta, Bombay, and Madras. Tudor ice was later harvested at Walden Pond in Massachusetts from a diary entry. I'll read. The noise of 100 Irishmen shattered the solitude of Henry David Thoreau's Walden Pond Sanctuary during the cold winter of 1846. Thoreau peeked out the windows of his rustic cabin and watched as the Tudor Ice Company's immigrant laborers started to cut out tons and tons of Walden Pond's frozen water. The ice trade began to focus more on the U.S., supplying the cities in the east and businesses in the Midwest. The citizens of New York and Philadelphia became huge customers for ice during their hot, long summers. They harvested additional ice from the Hudson River and as far north as Maine. Ice began to be used in refrigeration railroad cars by the railroad industry. This allowed the meatpacking industries, the stockyards in Chicago and Cincinnati, to slaughter cattle locally and ship cooled meat to the East Coast for both domestic and foreign shipments. These chilled refrigerator cars started huge new industries throughout the United States, shipping fresh fruits and vegetables to places that had never seen them before. American and British fishermen started loading their ships with ice. They could keep at sea a longer time, get larger catches, and keep them reasonably fresh. The brewing industry began to operate year-round. Exports diminished after 1870 due to limitations, and Norway became a major supplier in Europe. Started to get competition from mechanical ice machines. They were invented in the 1800s. First ones were very costly and not very reliable, but they were used where ice was most expensive. So they're building artificial ice plants in India and Australia. So they lost those markets for natural ice. By the outbreak of World War I, 1914, half the ice in the United States was manufactured instead of harvested. After World War I, the ice harvest business declined immediately. Every city had their own ice plant, manufactured ice. But ice home delivery remained a very vital service. Remember though, the first home electric refrigerators were not sold until the late 1930s. I grew up in a neighborhood, we all had ice boxes. For those who are not familiar with living with ice, ice keeps food cool, but it doesn't freeze it. No frozen food. Thank you.